Dear students, dear professors and friends of I3h, it is a great pleasure to meet you all for these annual lectures. The first after 2 years of COVID, so one more step in the right direction, the direction of normal life. Today, we are going to listen to the epidemiologist and vice-rector research of the ULB, Professor Marius Gilbert. We already know that a lot of questions will arise. As always, our speaker will answer as many as he can. And to start this lecture, please welcome the president of I3h, Professor Michel Goldman, who has also been one of the founders of the Institute. Michel, 2 years of COVID didn't mean less work for the Institute. It was actually a very intense time for communication, which is one of the topics of the lecture.
Thank you, Vanessa. First, let me welcome and thank all those who connected to follow this annual lecture together with our students. Indeed, the last 2 years were quite intense for the whole I3h team. As an organization dedicated to healthcare innovation, COVID-19 was obviously at the forefront of our activities. First, Mathias de Watripon has been involved in the expert group which advised the Belgian government, providing important insight into the economic dimensions of the pandemic. Myself, I assisted the media in making scientific advances understandable by a wider audience. And we developed together with Matthias and Hilde interdisciplinary research on various aspects of the pandemic in collaboration with colleagues across Europe. But education remained the cornerstone of I3h with our inter-university program for master students, a program led by Hilde Stevens with the active collaboration of Caroline Van Swieten. Actually, this annual lecture is an integral part of this program. I understand that this will be the last event of this year's program. Obviously, we had to organize all the teaching online, moving this year to a hybrid formula. Just 1 week ago, our students had the opportunity to attend on-site an exciting session with CEOs from several companies, an event organized with our partner HR1. And we will continue to pay special attention to professional development by contributing to a new advanced master program launched by the Solvay Brussels Schools of Economics and Management. So, as you understand, we will remain quite busy even after the pandemic regresses. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. An important part of the audience today is made of students, pharmacy, medicine, economic sciences, and biomedical sciences. They have different backgrounds, but the same interest in innovation and in healthcare. Hilde Stevens, you are the co-director of I3h. Could you please tell us more about this program?
Thank you, Vanessa. And indeed, the I3h Institute aims at developing the next generation of healthcare professionals. We continue to invest and improve our educational programs. And today we are finishing with our last module on the different challenges in healthcare innovation. And as you see in this picture, last week we had a very interesting on-site day where the program participants had the chance to meet various experts and get an insight in their careers, both how they failed and thrived in achieving their objectives, something that was particularly appreciated by our students. This year is already the 7th edition of the program, and as you can see, we continuously invest in offering this program to all those interested. Over the past year, we grew both in terms of students as well as the background of those students. They come from a variety of faculties, often in the biomedical field, as you can see below, but also from, for example, from economics and management, ICT, law, or the social sciences faculties. The majority of our students are master students, but the number of PhD students and postdocs grows every year. And each year, we are also very welcoming people already active as professionals in the field. And every year, we are honored to increase the participant network. This year, for example, with participants from the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp, Kom op tegen kanker, and the Rwanda Food and Drug Authority. to conclude, we conducted a survey amongst our program participants from the past program editions, and they confirmed that they had an overall positive experience with the program, particularly increasing the students' eagerness to continue their further development in the field of healthcare innovations. 8 out of 10 students would definitely recommend their colleagues to follow this program, and they particularly highlighted that they gained an increase in interest and insight in the roles of the different stakeholders and the need for collaboration and interdisciplinarity to speed up bringing patient-centric innovative therapies to the patients. We are very happy to include this year more than 125 students in our alumni network and grow this network of qualified healthcare professionals, with today 2 of our alumni participants giving a lecture in the program.
Thank you, Hilde. Before we move forward, I would like to remind you that I3h wants this lecture to be interactive. So do not hesitate to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Professor Gilbert will take the question after the lecture. Please mention your name, your organization, so that we know who you are and we can better answer your question. Without further delay, I will give the floor to Professor Marius Gilbert. He's co-director of the I3h Institute, former vice governor of the National Bank of Belgium, expert also helping the government from the beginning of the pandemic. Matthias, good morning. You are going to introduce your colleague at the university, as well as your colleague at the team of experts advising the government. Matthias. Matthias, I do not hear you. Yes.
Yes. So my apologies for this.
You're welcome.
So indeed, well, thank you, Vanessa. Welcome to everybody. Today it's my job, but also my privilege to introduce Marius as a holder of annual lecture. As you said, there was a hiatus due to COVID. The last one was in 2019, and it was Jean Tirole, Nobel laureate in economics in 2014, but also Dr. Honoris Causa of our university in 1989. So we were present. Now it's a great privilege to have Marius with us. So let me introduce him briefly. So Marius graduated in agricultural and applied biological sciences at ULB in 1995. Then he was a visiting researcher for 2 years at the Department of Zoology in Oxford University. And then he did a PhD in insect pest ecology at ULB in 2001, working subsequently on the invasion ecology of several insect pests before moving the focus of his research towards the spatial epidemiology of animal diseases. In 2006, he was awarded a permanent academic position with the Belgian Fonds National de la Recherche Scientifique. And since 2015, he's FNRS Senior Research Associate and leads at our university, the Spatial Epidemiology Lab. Marius has broad interest in the spatial epidemiology of animal diseases and invasive species, with as overarching theme the attempt to better understand how changes in agriculture have transformed ecosystems and affected the conditions of emergence, spread, and persistence of pathogens and invasive species, with as main area of expertise epidemiology of avian influenza, global changes in livestock production systems, and livestock distribution models. Now, Marius is a top researcher. He has many publications in top journals. He's much cited, for example, Google Scholar citation today, 16,831. But you know, in a sense, what I find particularly impressive with him is that, in a sense, just like the mRNA technology was there to help with the vaccine, well, Marius was there at the right time to help society and Belgium really, really much. Not just Belgium, by the way, because one amazing thing, is that in March 2020, he published as lead author in The Lancet, so one of the best, very best journal in medicine, a paper called Preparedness and Vulnerability of African Countries Against Importations of COVID-19, a modeling study. You know, a modeling study published in one of the best journals in March 2020. This is, I think, pretty amazing. And by the way, this has been hugely cited, more than 1,000 citations on Google Scholar. So he's a very, not only a good researcher, but also a very relevant researcher. And by the way, he's very much multifaceted. So it's not just top research, it's also very much policy. I was quite honored, and that was also thanks to Michel. I mean, all these things that happened to me in life sciences are thanks to Michel. I was honored to be able, with Michel, with Eric Muraille and Jean-Philippe Plateau, to contribute to a paper where Marius was the leading force, called Preparing for Responsible Lockdown Exit Strategy. So you see, already that was about policy, and that was published in Nature Medicine in April 2020. And I think when you go back to it, I think it aged pretty well, this paper about exit. So for me, thanks to that, and to Michel, who recommended me to the Prime Minister, I could enter this GIS group, the group for the exit strategy, group of experts on exit strategy, next to people who are already stars on this on the Belgian media, Eric Avlig, Marc van Rans, Emmanuel André, and Marius. And so I contributed a little bit the economics part of this. And I must say, it was really wonderful to interact with Marius, also with the other 8 people there. But Marius, together with Neil Hans, were the driving forces of the whole discussion about epidemiology. They really brought so much to this interdisciplinary group. And Marius was always interested in making sure that things could be at the same time scientifically rigorous and understandable to a large public. Therefore, he was indeed instantly a media star in French-speaking Belgium. And I think always in at times a pretty stressed period, because this crisis has not been easy, always with the idea to be balanced and serve the common good rather than score punches, individual punches, like some people do. I won't name names. And his book, Juste un passage au Juité, explains this beautifully. And therefore, all these competencies. Now, of course, it meant that our rector offered him the job of vice rector for research, which is clearly UL-based game. Of course, that's also a lot of work, but it's great that Marius can still take the time to keep educating the public and educating us today. So a very big welcome to you, Marius. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for those very nice words. It's been quite an adventure, and I'm very happy to be given the chance today to share that experience, which has been very intense, as you described. We're not entirely over yet, but we are on a much, much better way now. For the rest of my talk, let me share my screen and PowerPoint application. Let me just put it on full screen. If you don't see my opening slide, please shout out loud. So my talk is going to be about science communication, health literacy, and public confidence. And the reason for having focused my talk on this aspect is, well, let me first introduce myself, because very briefly, Matthias already did that with lots of details. We are in our lab very active in what we call spatial epidemiology, is that we look at diseases and vectors from the angle of the geographical space. We're trying to understand what are the factors, geographical factors, that can better explain the emergence, spread, and persistence of diseases and vectors. And for doing that, we use a combination of tools ranging from spatial modeling, phylogenetics and phylogeography, and host mapping. So those are quite technical tools, but the ultimate aim is always the same. We're trying to better understand how different sets of disease and vectors distribute over space and time, and what are the underlying factors that favor or slow down the spread of those disease and vectors. Before I get into this, I think it's useful to remind a little bit what has been my itinerary into this, this pandemic, because my whole really changed over time. And my background, of course, is in research. So when the pandemic first emerged in December, January, and February, naturally, that was my first entry point was research. And I started being involved in communication because I had followed very closely the development of the disease in Asia. And this was linked to our previous research on avian influenza. Working on avian influenza, I've been collaborating for more than 10 years with scientists in Asia, including in human health, in Vietnam, China, Thailand. And of course, avian influenza has always been studied in the context of pandemic emergence, because it was a possible candidate for a pandemic. So when we learned that there was a particular kind of pneumonia developing in southern China, our first fear was that it may be an avian influenza. It wasn't, but we really kept a very close eye with many of my colleagues on that. So my first entry into this was research, was starting to do a little bit of communication. And then came the lockdown in Belgium. And then I realized that I would find myself a lot more useful in trying to make people better understand what was happening, because it was so massive, so abrupt, so quick, that it was really a big shock, causing lots of angst to society. And I thought that at the time that my role as a scientist was to help society better understand what is happening, because when you understand a thing, you can better control your emotions, your fear, your angst, and you can, because you're in better control of things. So I started doing lots of media intervention, being present on social media as well. And then came the time when my role shifted to help in decision-making by joining the Groupe d'Experts pour l'Exit Stratégie, the GACE, where my job was mainly to do decision-making, and I pulled off a little bit from communication in the media, because there was a bit of a conflict of interest in doing both at the same time. And this lasted until September 2020, with the last period that spent until now, where I came back to research, but with a different role as vice director of research. But I stayed involved in communication in the media with a little bit more distance. So I tried to not add noise to the noise, but to have more qualitative input into the media. So what I'd like to do today is to try to share this experience through this pandemic itinerary in terms more specifically of communication and what matters to communication. And why is communication so important is that when your first way of handling the pandemic is through behavioral changes in the population, because that was the case. When the pandemic struck, we had no mask, we had no test, we had no vaccines, we had very little option for treatment. So the only thing we could do is to try to slow down the spread of the epidemic through change in behavior. And you can only maintain those changes in behavior through trust and public confidence. So there's been, retrospectively, those two papers have looked at this more closely, and they clearly demonstrate a very strong correlation between the resilience of countries to COVID-19 with trust, with public trust in the authorities, and trust between people themselves. And this was shown by two different teams, two independent studies that show this correlation that when there is more trust, there was better action and more efficient action within the countries that have been affected by the pandemic. So communication and public trust are absolutely key, and we've seen it more lately with all the questions related to the vaccine uptake. So how do you do with that? So when I entered this role in communication, I had three pillars. Those were, it was so improvised. I had never done that before, so it was mostly out of common sense. But I thought, I won't survive this if I don't have, strong pillars. And my three pillars were first to try to have a clear line of thought. So what would be my role? And my role, and this is something I've tried to maintain throughout my communication during the entire pandemic, was to try to find a good balance between alarmism and banalization, because both are very important risk. If your communication is permanently on the alarm mode, it becomes less and less efficient over time, and it creates angst. And I would like to distinguish fear and angst. Fear is a very natural mechanism that triggers a change in our behavior to avoid a threat. So it's something that is biologically built into us. We have fear because that's how we change our behavior to avoid a threat. But when fear is permanent, it becomes angst. And when there is angst, it promotes movement, it fixes you, and it has a very detrimental effect on mental health. So having a permanent anxiogenic kind of communication has its own problem. And on the opposite side, banalization is also a problem. If you're not aware of the threat, you don't change move, you don't increase your vigilance, and you don't react adequately. So my line of communication has always been to try to find the good balance between those two. And every time I was saying something in the media, I would think, what is the good balance now in my communication between those two extremes? The second pillar was to try to be as much didactic as I could be. And to always, even if I was asked, what's your opinion on this measure, or what's your opinion on this or this, to try to first explain what is at stake, to try to first start the conversation or start the communication with a didactic sensing, so explaining what is at stake in simple terms before even mentioning my opinion. And that allows to empower the people who you speak to, because when people understand, they're empowered in the way they can receive your message and in the way they can respond to that message. And the third pillar has been to rely on the scientific method, always trying to communicate with publicly available data and facts, and to try to trust the consensus. And I'll get back to this. But along the way, I've discovered a number of obstacles to communication that have been extremely difficult to overcome. Compared to the normal role of epidemiologists, time is completely changed. You're used to produce knowledge when you have time to make publication in the long run. Suddenly, you're forced to sometimes analyze data in the morning and to communicate them to a meeting with the Prime Minister in the evening. So all the temporal dimension is completely changed. The people you speak to are not the same. You have a diverse set of recipients of communication, and those recipients don't have the same knowledge as you. They can be decision makers, they can be journalists, they can be citizens to who you speak through the media. All those people have very heterogeneous background, and most of the time they don't have your knowledge. So we are used as scientists to speak to other scientists who have the same jargon, with whom we have a shared knowledge. So that has been a big obstacle. Because there is no time, there's no peer review, so there is not this correcting by the peers, and so you're more prone to errors, and that's something that you have to be aware. Another obstacle is that everything is changing fast, because you know, it's a new pandemic. The amount of knowledge is limited. So knowledge is permanently evolved, and you have to adapt your advice and communication to the knowledge that is evolving. But that becomes viewed as being inconsistent by the public, because they would say, you know, you say this now, but that's not what you said 6 months ago. And sometimes, and most of the time, it's because the knowledge we've gained has changed over time. And then, of course, the advice or the recommendations we can do have changed too. It's normal in science, but it's not something that people are used to, because they expect from policymakers and from politicians some sort of coherence. So they're not used to the fact that your advice about something, your view about something could change over time. There's always this suspicion of conflict of interest that's popping up every now and then. There is this, what I call the weight of personal observations that you have to fight against, and I'll come back to this with a little bit more details. And then there what I call the franc-tireur. Franc-tireur, it's a French expression, but it describes, you know, independent voices. And even within the scientific domain, you've had independent voices that have positioned themselves in a way that is, you know, I am right and all other experts are wrong. And this, when you work in science, you know that it's not necessarily the, you know, that it should raise an alarm bell in your mind. But for the public, they're not aware of that. And handling those franc-tireurs is very difficult, because they can create considerable noise and difficulties in the communication. So let me start with a few, I'll spend some time in a few more aspects that I will present slightly more in depth. I'm going to spend a few slides on this second bullet point here, which is the fact that you speak to people with no shared knowledge. And let me give this first example. So what is obvious to an expert, or what is obvious to know those who are familiar with health outcome, is rarely communicated and is not necessarily obvious to everyone. And the first time I realized that was that when people were questioning the right-hand map. So the right-hand map is a map of the number of cases per municipalities that there was at the time. And then I was seeing lots of questions, you know, why are there so many cases in the northern part of the country? And for me, you know, this was something that was so obvious, it's simply because there's more people, that I never took the time to express it. And I realized that what is obvious to scientists, what is obvious to us, becomes not communicated. So we need to pay a lot of attention to communicate also about what is obvious, and to try to spend some time to communicate also about what makes a wide consensus among scientists. And that's a very important point, and I will come back to it later. The second element, consequence that there's no shared understanding, another example, is this difference between observables and the epidemic. So it is clear from an epidemiological point of view that the way you look at the epidemic in terms of testing policy has a strong influence on your metrics. So during the first wave, testing was limited to death and severe cases. And then in May, it was extended to include milder cases. And into June, we started the test and tracing policy, and then it also included asymptomatic. So what a positive case is represented changed very, very strongly between the first wave and May and stretching into June. But yet, Cienzano continued to report, you know, the number of cases. So that's the left-hand graph here. But then if you're not aware of those changes in those case definition, then people and journalists could have the impression that suddenly, you know, in July and in September at the time, you were reaching levels that were similar to the first wave. But when we look at the hospitalization number, that is much more related to the true impact of the epidemic into population, you know, we were not close at all to the level that we had in the first wave. So this difference between observable and the true epidemic is not something that is intuitive. You have to explain it, and you have to be didactic, and you can, in that you can make careful use of metaphors, like explaining to people that, you know, our testing system is like a thermometer, and that, you know, if you don't put your thermometer right, if you place it differently, you will have a different picture on your disease. But that's something that needs to be communicated. Another another example that came at the time is the low familiarity with number and the nature of contagion and exponential growth. So this slide here illustrates very nicely what happens if the number of grains of rice double every time you move from one square to the next. So if you think of those as disease cases, and you stay in the first 3 cases, you will think, okay, things are, it's fine, you know, we don't have a problem. Then you take the next 6 square and you think, oh, okay, it's increasing, but it's still manageable. And then you go to the next one, you think, oh, we should do something about it. And then you go to the next 3 and it's, we overwhelmed. We can't do anything. We need to act very urgently. But from an epidemiological point of view, the growth has been constant. It's been doubling at the same rate. So the warning that the epidemiological trying to communicate is that it's doubling, it's doubling, it's doubling, but people think and receive the message in terms of absolute number rather than instead of change. And that creates a very difficult tension in terms of communication. It has all other implications. When you have a contagious process, and that you are familiar with what is a contagious process, it is very obvious that the earlier you act, the more benefit you will have. So if this diagram here shows, you know, a tentative diagram of transmission where one person, you know, infect 2 or 3 people, and it illustrates that if one person worked from home or another person didn't go to a barbecue, it will prevent many cases down the chains of transmission. So when you see this like this, it's obvious that it's better to act at the left-hand arrow than at the right-hand arrow. But that's not something people are used to consider. So you have to, when the communication, to choose the right narrative. And for this, you know, people think of risk and risk management in term of, they think of it like car accidents. You know, the more effort you put into preventing the risk, the more benefit you will have, and that increases proportionally to the amount of effort you put into it. But a contagious process is not handled at that. So it's not the right narrative. So you have to build a different narrative, and a very good narrative for this, for example, is that of a forest fire. If you communicate about an epidemic saying it has to be viewed and managed as a forest fire, then it becomes obvious to everyone that you don't need to wait until half of your forest is burned before to act. So that even if you have very small fire that have been observed in your forest, you need to act and to extinguish them. And the earlier you act, the better. So the narrative that goes around the communication is very important because it will influence people's perception on what is the proportional benefits of the actions. There's also a misunderstanding of, and that's linked to the previous point, of the relationship between the measures and the outcome, and it's also linked to what we call the prevention paradox. When prevention works, it's not visible. For example, at the time, it was, for example, in July 2020, there was a relatively low number of deaths per day, and there was still a lot of measure in place. And then the government was heavily criticized with this sentence, like, you know, le risque zéro n'existe pas. There's no zero risk. We should accept a higher level of risk. But if at the time you had, like, say, 5 deaths per day, let's imagine that a higher acceptable level of risk would have been 50 deaths per day. You could relax the measure, and then the pandemic would go up. And then there would be a point at which you should slow it down, where you should stabilize the transmission. So if you were to let the pandemic go up until 50, and at that time you were trying to reinforce those measures, the measures that you were going to have to take at the level of 50 are going to be exactly the same as the one you had at the level of 5. That is to say that stabilizing the transmission is mostly independent from where you are. And so if you leave the transmission go to a high level, in fact, you haven't gained anything, because the measure that you'll have to put and maintain at this level of 50 deaths per day are identical to the one that you have to put and maintain at 5 deaths per day. So there's no benefit in letting the pandemic go to those high levels. Another very common misconception is the fact that, you know, the public, and it's not only about the public, you know, I had all of what I'm saying here is I've had the same difficulties in the large public with decision makers and sometimes with journalists. So it's just the fact that people have not been trained to learn those things. Another aspect is the multifactorial nature of health outcome. It is obvious to epidemiologists that when you have an health event, there is lots of different factors that can influence it. And we've listened many times, especially during the first and second wave, that Sweden would have been much better at handling the pandemic than us, because they've had a lower first wave, slightly higher, and a lower second wave than Belgium, and yet they had pretendedly almost no measure in place. Well, first, if you compare Sweden with its neighboring countries, it's a completely different story. Here you have the number of deaths per million in Sweden compared to Denmark, Norway, and Finland. In Norway and Finland, actually, they managed to have almost no excess mortality through the first 2 waves. And what was the recipe? Well, lockdown. They did as we did in Belgium. So what is, and also in Sweden, it wasn't as if they did nothing. They also, you know, there was this myth that Sweden acts so much likely than other countries, but if you measure this, and this is a measure of the stringency index of the different measures, and Sweden is here in purple. Of course, it was a bit lower than the other countries, but they didn't do nothing. They did to take a lot of intervention at different point in time. But of course, in Sweden, there's lots of things that differentiate Sweden from Belgium. There's human population density. The household composition is different. There is a higher fraction of people who live alone. The level of social trust and adhesion to government's recommendation is also very different. The contact structure between people is different. So it's only, and all those factors are a lot closer between Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland than they are to Belgium. So when you take all of that into account, the narrative about Sweden is completely transformed, and Sweden can actually not be taken necessarily as an example that performed particularly well. I'll skip this because time is flying, but there's very, very quickly overall a misunderstanding on the nature of what mathematical modeling can do, and that's low familiarity with what models can produce. And you keep being challenged by what I call franc-tireur, and one very popular statement that has been spreading a lot was that this was not worse than the flu. And you know, even when you were putting together all the different studies, and here you have the infection fatality rate of different studies, and each of those red line here is a different study. So it shows how on the logarithmic scale, the infection fatality ratio increase with age. And the blue lines here are the ones for seasonal influenza. And this data, those data were available quite early, in fact, in the pandemic, but still the messaging about that that is not worse than the flu has been maintained over time. So you have to think of why are you being challenged by those francs-tireurs? You have to think, where do they shoot from? So what's their motive? And to try to remind the public about the scientific method and about the fact that, you know, francs-tireurs are not always wrong, but if they think that they are right and that the entire rest of the scientists are wrong, their first job should be to put together data and hard evidence to convince other scientists that they are wrong, not to bypass the other scientists through YouTube or through social media to try to convince the public. So whenever a scientist adopts this mechanism to communicate, it should ring an alarm bell, and public and decision makers should be aware of that. That is completely, it's not the science, that's not how science works. Science works through convincing others with evidences and data that you are right, and that's how science progresses. There is also what I call the weight of personal observations, and this is something that is very, very often underestimated in communication. And what is the weight of personal observation? What happens around you in terms of the people you interact with, what you observe, has much more influence on your behavior, on your actions, than what goes through your rationality. So what you read, what you learn from observation made by others. And there's been many examples to which I have been confronted where the weight of personal observation was very hard to be balanced by larger statistics. You know, I remember a meeting of the CNS, Conseil National de Sécurité, National Security Council, where one of the ministers said in front of all the other ministers, you know, I don't see why we should be so worried. I called the head of the hospital in my municipality and he told me that everything is fine. And this is not unique. I've heard it many times from different people. Or an alternative was for someone working in the lab saying most of our samples are negative, or the number of observation that the number of deaths is currently very low, and that's an abusive generalization about time. Or people who simply have observed that in their family, someone died in the week following the vaccination. All of those are simply observations that are made by people that become generalized at a higher level, at the population level, or generalized over time. And they are very difficult to influence, because the people who make those observations feel absolutely legitimate to make that observation. They've lived it, they've experienced it, and it's hard to come with alternative to change those people's mind. So you have to always struggle against this weight of personal observations. Another struggle has been that most of the decisions that have been taken in this pandemic were a mixture between where you had a number of scientific arguments that were mixing with policy decisions. And that led to criticism such as, you know, we can't go to restaurants with proper distancing, but tramways are packed. How could that be? That's a complete nonsense. But it's not a nonsense if you consider that from a policy perspective, you know, giving people the rights to public transport, to mobility, is a very, very essential right that needs to be reinstalled very, very early. You know, if there is no mobility in your society, you have a big problem. So you allow public transport, and you're trying to make protocols to minimize transmission in the public transport, even knowing that it's not going to be fully prevented. The same reasoning is about closing schools. There's always been evidence of transmission within schools. But it's been a policy decision. At some point in the pandemic, there was this policy decision that schools were considered a very, very important element that needs to be maintained, because it had multiple benefits in terms of mental health of the kids themselves, in terms of their education future, in terms of mental health of the parents, in terms of allowing parents to work, etc. It had multiple benefits, so it became a priority, even if it contributed to the transmission. So once you see that those decisions are a mixture between policy decisions and scientific evidences, you start understanding a lot better apparent contradictions such as the one highlighted here. So I started my itinerary into this pandemic with those three pillars that I started my presentation with. But of course, through all that experience, I've learned a lot, and the key messages that I have learned are summarized in the next couple of slides. First, I had completely underestimated the power of metaphors and narratives. If you choose the right metaphor and narrative, it has a huge leverage effect. I use the example of the forest fire. If all politicians, all journalists had viewed the epidemic as a forest fire from the beginning, many things would have become a lot obvious, a lot more obvious, and decision making would have been a lot higher. It's kind of it's a bit mind-boggling that you think that sometimes it's only linked to that, but it is. I realize it is really important. Another example I haven't mentioned in my presentation, I talked about the weight of observation. I remember I was once at the news and I was asked the questions about someone who had made an observation in her lab that there was very, very few positive cases. And, I said, well, I've never been burglared. I've never been myself victim of a crime. I feel thankful, but I'm not going to use that argument to say that burglars and crime don't exist. And what you're doing is exactly that. So through metaphors, narrative, you can go against those different difficulties. And it's very important to think very carefully that the metaphor and narrative that you use is adequate and does not lead to problems as well. So it's very, very important. The weight of personal observations, where does it come from? And the fact that people who make those observations feel legitimate. If your first reaction as an expert is to say, you're stupid, this is nonsense, look at the statistics, and make an argument of power of authority, you're losing the person with whom you speak to. So you have to realize that the person is legitimate in that personal observation, to adopt empathy in the way you communicate with that person, with the fact that you may well be right, but if you see it from a different perspective, from a broader perspective, it's not contradictory with what I'm telling you, and then refer to publicly available, more generalized data. You can convince people even if the weight of personal observation is high. One aspect that I haven't spoken of until now is the diversity of recipients. The people you speak to have very, very diverse living conditions, culture, perspectives. People are struggling in their daily life, sometimes for living, for lodging, for eating. If you don't add, and people have different ways to be informed. Not all people look at the at the TV news. My kids, they never do. They only inform themselves through social networks. So you have to diversify and adapt the communication to the different mechanism channels and to the different public. A very homogenized types of communication, you always miss a significant amount of the recipients. Another learnings is that I mentioned it a little bit briefly in the beginning, is that from a journalist perspective, what is obvious is not very interesting to tell. From an expert perspective, what is obvious, the expert don't even think it's worth communicating it because it is so obvious. So what happens in the end is that the obvious is rarely communicated. And there is another aspect to this question that is linked to it, is that, if a journalist brings two experts at the same table, 90% or 95% of the time is going to be devoted to what they disagree on. Because that's why they've been brought at the table. From a journalist perspective, that's what makes them interesting. They're going to offer different perspective on something. But a consequence of that is that they won't communicate about what makes consensus, what they agree on. And from a public perspective, what they see is scientists who communicate most of the time about what they disagree. And the communication about the consensus is lost. So this is something that is very important. And I think we're really learning that it's really important from an expert perspective to remind the obvious. And even if you put in a position where you have to discuss with another expert, try communicating the consensus first. Try to first describe what you agree on. And this became very apparent for me with vaccination. There was lots of debates about, what's the benefit of vaccination in terms of reducing the risk of infection, the link with the COVID safety kit, etc. But people failed to communicate with as much intensity about the fact that it worked so well against the risk of hospitalization and death. And most of the people who were speaking about that, most of the time they agree on that, but they fail to communicate about it. The fact that knowledge is changing over time is a very difficult thing, because people expect your advice, your views, your expertise to be consistent. So the only way I have found is to try to stay as much honest as one can be about what is known and unknown. And not being afraid to say, we don't know, we don't have evidence for that. I cannot tell you an answer, we simply don't know. And also to be honest about the changes in evidences that have been taking place over time. The data we had on the efficiency of vaccines and on the maintenance of this efficiency, we had over time, we had limited data in the beginning. Yet there was a decision to be made. We wanted to get out of this pandemic, and those decisions led to a certain vaccination strategy that happened to be very useful in terms of reducing the risk of hospitalization and death, and we wouldn't be where we are now without that. But of course, when suddenly, there's a need for a third dose, if you're not able to tell, well, this is a novel evidence, we didn't know that we may need the third dose because we didn't have enough time with the cohort to know that it would be necessary. Well, there is a problem in communication. So you can't convince people that a third dose is needed if you're not able to tell that in the beginning, well, you simply didn't know about it. And finally, this question of divergent view between experts, I think it's very important that we maintain a diversity of that the debate keeps being alive. It's part of democracy, and it's something that we have to nurture. But we have to, and that's a responsibility of the scientific community itself. One of the problems that we've had through this pandemic is that too often the scientific debate has been taking place in public, in the media, or through opinion letters in newspapers, whereas it was not actually happening so actively outside of the media. Expert groups were working together. They had lots of exchanges between them. Sometimes you had different other groups that assembled themselves, but the communication between the scientific community has actually been quite low. So I think that as scientists, we should really, in a crisis situation like that, where science is so at the heart of the crisis, we should have a lot more scientific exchanges between the scientists, especially between those who are part of the expert group and those who are outside of the expert group, so that they can better understand the conditions under which the ones who are in the expert group are working, and vice versa, so that those who are in the expert group could be challenged from time to time by other scientists, as long as the debate remains fair, but and based on science, the scientific methods. But being challenged is a good thing. Peer reviewing is a good thing. So there's only more benefit to more active exchanges, so that when scientists express different view in the media, at least it doesn't come from misunderstanding. It doesn't come from the fact that they haven't had the chance to discuss before that. And within that, I think I will close now, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilbert. We already have questions, and the first one will be asked, if she's there with us, from one of the person in the audience. I don't think she's there with us, so I'm going to read her question. The question was about trust. She's saying that a key factor in communication about health is trust. People trust decrease when messaging is sometimes contradictory. And she's asking you, how do you manage to regain or to gain the trust of the targeted audience in this case?
Yeah, I answer partly. I think there are different, there are conditions that makes your communication to be trusted. Let me put it from a different angle. Mistrust comes from when people have the impression that important decisions regarding their life are taken behind closed doors in conditions that are unclear by people who they don't know who they've been chosen, that when there are suspicions of conflicts of interest, etc. So you have to take that reverse angle, and the only way to build and maintain trust is to be honest about what is known and unknown, to be honest about the possible conflict of interest. That's clear. That experts' advices, when experts are linked to decision makers, are made public, and that the conditions under which experts have been grouped are clear to the citizens. When those conditions are encountered, that's already a good start. Then there's the question of what happens when different scientists speak to each other and contradict each other. And that's a much more difficult aspect, because if suddenly you start, giving the voice only to the same view, and that other scientists who want to express legitimate views are silenced, it doesn't create trust. It creates mistrust. So you have to make the debate happening. but you have somehow to channel this debate with, and to make it based on the scientific method. And that's only through educating people of how science works that you can make that happen. And that's a long-term endeavor, I'm afraid. And that's very difficult. So it's difficult to give a more, yeah, I'll stop here because we could go for a while on this.
Okay, maybe the topic of the next conference for this person. We also have a question from a student, because we know that students have been sharing this opportunity with us, non-students. So a question from Xiti Singh. I'm sorry, because I'm sure that your name hasn't been pronounced the way it is supposed to be. Singh, you can ask your question. We don't hear you. Hi. It's
can
fine.
you hear me now? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the great talk. So yeah, regarding the metaphors, I also had like similar experience as you. Like recently, I gave some presentation, and I talked about considering body like a house and cells like bricks. And I gave that metaphor. For me, like that was not a big metaphor, but like it, on some of the people in the community, it had a great effect, and they said, yeah, this made really sense to them. So yeah, so I think, yeah, that's a really important point. But my question is, like, what kind of publicly available data sources do you use when you do this kind of science communication? Like, what are your most common places to go to get the data?
Yeah, that's a very important aspect, because in the earlier stage of the pandemic in Belgium, you know, there was lots of question about the availability of the data on the number of cases and on the number of deaths, and this is being collected and published by Cienzano, who is the Institute of Public Health, who is responsible for that in Belgium. So there was a very strong plea, you know, quite early in the pandemic, so that a number of data sets so that could become available and could be available in the public domain. And this really helped us. And we made that plea, but it was not sufficient, I would say. You know, we would have dreamt and we would have hoped for more data set on more aspects, but at least there was this move. And Cienzano has also been putting, you know, some web interface where you can query those data, visualize them usefully. They have made a lot of work in making reports and daily reports. And that helps communication a lot, because you can refer to reports that are available in the public domain. So that's something that is very important. And it's linked to the previous question about transparency. You know, when people have the impression that some kind of truth is hidden from their eyes, you know, that creates mistrust. So you have to try to move transparency, but then you're moving the problem to another level, because at Cienzano, you know, itself was at some point accused of the way they were counting the death, of the fact that hospitalized patients were in fact patients that were hospitalized for a different reason, but they happened to be COVID positive, and that those were included as hospitalized because of COVID infection. You know, you're displacing the problems, because then the problems becomes, you know, people accuse those who collect the data sometimes to manipulate the data to show for some kind of messaging. So even then, for an institute like Cienzano, it becomes very important to try to be quite open and transparent on the methodology that they use. Because there's no, you know, everyone can understand that, especially in a condition of pandemic, that you cannot set up a perfect system in 2 weeks. That data collection may have biases, but as long as you are transparent about those biases and that you are honest on the methodology and how data are collected, then things can be explained. And for example, this example I gave you about hospitalization with COVID or for COVID, is something that was quietly debunked by journalists, who took the time to contact Cienzano, understand how they were collecting the data, and then making articles where they were describing, where this bias could have been introduced and how data should be interpreted. So that's transparency at all levels is the only good prevention against mistrust, but sometimes it can conflict with GDPR regulations and vice versa. Sometimes GDPR regulations have been used as a way, as an argument, sometimes to do not disclose some data. So not everything has been perfect, but it's here again, that would hope we could make an entire talk about that aspect.
Thank you. As you see on your screen, we are promoting some of you as panelists so that you can ask your questions. Please, when you do, try to make it like very, very briefly, because we have a lot of questions. So the shorter you can and the more question Marius Gilbert will be able to take. I will give the floor to Hilde Stevens. She had a question. She's a student somehow, I mean.
I have different role. Yes, Marius, thank you so much for your very clear talk. I actually had two short questions. I will keep it short. The first question is, is there a communication strategy for the public with respect to what will happen in the fall? What if COVID or the number of infections go up again? Will people have trust to go back to a somewhat more restricted life? And the second question is, in the Flemish news, there was even the Dag where Pierre van Damme, a vaccinologist, a very well-respected medical doctor, was put next to a medical doctor who was actually an anti-vaxxer. Do we need to give these people a platform because there is the freedom of speech, but they don't increase the public confidence? How do you see this?
Okay, the first one is going to be quick to answer. I don't know. I think Matthias would be better placed to answer that first question, but maybe later. So I'm not aware of a specific communication strategy for the autumn at the moment. Certainly, this is something that would be useful to work or think about. But since I'm not part of that, I won't comment. On the second question, I mean, that's the typical, it's not new to this pandemic. There was the same questioning about how, climate skeptics are represented in the media. For the media, especially when they come from an angle of covering politics or etc., they have this reflex, and they've been trained to do so, to try to present alternative views. I mean, to make an interesting debate about a topic. But science is not this, it doesn't work like that. There's not a scientific debate about the fact that the Earth is a sphere, and it's not flat. You cannot. You could have a very fun debate with someone who think it is flat, but it's not something that can be put on the same way or thought on the same way as a policy debate. And through the pandemic, I've seen a change in the way journalists approach that. I think what is really, really important is to try to give a sense to the public of what's the level of consensus, and that the level of consensus is somehow reflected in the way things are covered. So to put it, and when there are different voices that are expressed, I don't think they should be silenced. I think they should be contextualized, and contextualized with regard to the consensus. Because if you tell to people, okay, even if regarding climate, 99% of the climate scientists, agree on this, and we have this person who disagree on this, then, well, of course, it's taken from a different angle. So I think it's a very difficult question, because the if you silence those alternative voice, you know, they pop up everywhere else. You know, we have now in Belgium a media called Belgian Alternative Media, BAM, who creates, you know, who's been putting together tens of YouTube videos, disseminating, you know, very often false informations about vaccines. And they're very, you know, they've also invited esteemed scientists who fell in the trap, because they were asked to join one of their show, and then asked questions, etc. They became part of their content, and that starts giving credibility to their platform, because they've invited esteemed scientists. I had my colleague Muriel Moser. You know, she didn't know BAM. She went there very naively. She started answering questions about vaccine, etc. And then she became part of their content, next to other contents with people who were saying completely crazy things. So I always refused to go to BAM because I was aware of that, and I didn't want them to give this the credibility. But if you don't channel those legitimate questions through your mainstream media, it comes elsewhere. So I think the best prevention against that is to find a way, and we don't have the perfect solution yet, to find a way to channel those alternative voices through existing media, through proper contextualization, but that requires a lot more work from the journalists themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And since professors ask questions, then students follow. So we have a student with us. Can we, yeah, Neo is not there with us. So maybe before Neo asks his question, we can ask Bruno Flamion, who's also with us, to ask his question.
Thank you, Vanessa. Just a brief question. First, I mean, this issue of communicating and the skepticism about the vaccine in particular is fascinating. I can tell you that among my medical students, a lot are vaccinoceptics in third year of medicine. But anyway, no, my question to Marius, because I've received a lot of questions on this one. There was a paper in British Medical Journal last year comparing the excess deaths, just the death, between the different countries, 37, and Belgium was on the bad side, I would say, especially with regard to the elderly in our society. So I wonder, is it a wrong comparison? Is it some kind of social, you know, social conditions of our elders compared to other countries? Do you have any epidemiological ideas?
I mean, I can certainly comment on it. Excess death is a very robust method to estimate, you know, what the impact. And it is true that especially after the first wave, you know, the level of excess deaths we had in Belgium ranked us proportionally to our population in some of the top countries in terms of impact. But if you look over time, then we were completely caught up by other countries who had a much more severe second wave, for example, in terms of excess deaths, such as, for example, in Central Europe. And then over time, you know, the rank, if you include the pandemic through the different waves, the ranking of Belgium went down, down, and down. And I've looked a little bit at that because I was particularly surprised. You know, when you look at the first wave, for example, you know, many countries have broadly followed the same method, you know, lockdowns essentially, because there was no other option. But the outcome in terms of mortality has been very different, and some countries didn't have any excess death at all. And Norway is one of those examples. And when you look at that, at what makes really the difference is the timing. So Belgium, as many highly populated places in Europe and economically very active areas, being a hub, etc., was exposed to the pandemic very early. So the epidemic had the time to develop quite strongly compared to other countries before the lockdown started. But then the lockdown was decided almost simultaneously in Europe. You know, if you look at the date of the lockdown, they followed each other very closely. So some countries implemented their lockdown at times when their epidemic had not developed yet. And that's the case for Sweden. So to take the comparison of the forest fire again, you know, our fire was already quite well developed when the Canadair broke the water to try to bring it. But in Norway, there was only a few matches here and there. And of course, the benefit is completely transformed. So when you include the timing of intervention in your assessments, it explains a very, very large part of the variability in the outcome in terms of excess death. That's the first factor. And then come other factors such as, you know, the age pyramids, the prevalence of comorbidities, you know, all the other factors that may influence the death toll given a certain amount of transmission.
Thank you. We will ask Neo to ask his question or her question. I'm sorry, I do not know who's going to be there because Neo doesn't have the video, just the audio.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yonde, for that excellent presentation. Mine was just related to, you know, I think you answered about that BEM, but there's been a whole lot of conspiracy theories, in quotes, so to speak, related to COVID-19 as a disease and vaccination, particularly in my context of, you know, third world countries, where it contributes significantly to you know, things like vaccine hesitancy. I wondered, is there any innovative way of countering that, those voices of conspiracy that there's nothing like COVID, or vaccines will do this and that, or they are related to Bill Gates and whatever not, you know, that there's a huge amount of those kind of conspiracies, and they contribute really to our outcomes. So I was wondering if you have any advice related to how can governments counter those kind of narratives. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm afraid there's no magic bullet against this, and it's not specific to health crisis. In fact, every time there is, you know, an event that hits the media that becomes very important to everyone, you have conspiracy theories emerging left, right, and center. I remember the 9/11. You know, think about the number of conspiracy theories there was behind 9/11, and that spread through social media. And those are very difficult to counteract, because what those theories are essentially, they provide alternative narratives to the, so to say, official narrative, and that have some kind of internal consistency. So they will build on observable facts, and they will simply align those facts and put them into an alternative narrative that fits cultural belief, so to say, or an alternative beliefs. And that becomes very difficult, because if you want to counter those narratives, you really have to take one fact after the other. And it's incredibly difficult. It made me realize, you know, it was a lesson of modesty, you know. It made me realize that most of what we take for granted for sciences are inaccessible to our senses. So to say, you know, I've never seen an atom, I've never seen a molecule, but I believe they exist because there is an internal consistency in science that make me believe that they exist. But ultimately, it's a story. It's a story that has its internal consistency, and that allows to make predictions, and that's how science distinguishes itself from, you know, religions or other things. it's able to make predictions that are independent from the observers. It has its internal consistency. It is self-corrective. But in order to realize all of that, you need a deep understanding of how science works. And that's what makes it very difficult to go against this. That I've experienced it in my personal life. I had someone very close who are very became very anti-vax and very active on social network, and I spent hours with him, trying to convince him with all my knowledge, with all my data, even with my personal bonds to that person. I wasn't able to reverse his view, and it's a real challenge. And so, but one thing I'd like to stress though is that we shouldn't overestimate the influence of those alternative narrative either. We shouldn't underestimate them, but especially in the social media, they have a very strong, they're very vocal, they speak a lot, but actually there is a big contrast in what they truly represent in terms of population. And I was struck that when we were contrasting, their presence in the media with the actual result from survey, when you ask people, what do you trust, etc., actually a significant amount of people, are quite careful with that. So we shouldn't think that because we see them so vocal, they have a huge level of power. And even for vaccine hesitancy in Belgium, for example, there is a very large amount of vaccine hesitancy that is in fact not related to those kind of conspiracy theories, that are simply linked to people who are completely disconnected from first-line medicine and who are in situation of precarity, or for whom there are some cultural barriers, etc. So yeah, so that's what I can say about it.
Professor, we normally have 10 minutes left, and we still have 3 questions. So can we maybe extend of 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, okay, let's do it. Then next question will be from Vincent Noël, who's a student, and he's going to talk about Peter Piot.
Okay. First, thank you for your very nice presentation. Mr. Peter Piot said recently that we are entering in a pandemic era. Okay, you were studying geography, you are using studying policies. Okay, could you agree with the fact that the HIV would be a post-colonial virus? Ebola could be a post-war virus in Sierra Leone, for instance, and SARS-2, the COVID-19 will be a post or climate change virus. It could be another little question. Some people studying political science are speaking about catastrophe, maybe about after Katrina. I think about Naomi Klein, which was writing a book like La gestion des crises hors cadre. Okay, could the political science include now public health and health science? And finally, okay, that already did those 2 questions, otherwise there won't be time.
At least one, maybe, Professor, at least one, because we still have questions.
But the second one is going to be answered very quickly. Yes, I think, health should become a topic. At least basic notions of health should be taught to all people who are becoming involved in policy. But that's to have it aside. But for the pandemic era, I'm not, I feel very humble to because I have great esteem and admiration for Peter Piot, but I'm not as convinced as he seems to be. But maybe what he meant has been too summarized. But in my experience, we've seen indeed that a number of emergencies, and those are linked to exacerbating factors. You know, the mobility that we have today is not the one that we had in the past. You know, the ecosystems are a lot more stretched than they were. You know, there are land use changes that have been connected to emergencies, etc. But in parallel to that, our capacity to early detect and act upon emerging pandemic has also expanded. And we've known in the past several emerging infectious diseases that have been contained. MERS has, you know, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome emerged and it has been contained. Ebola, you know, it was the fact that it reached an epidemic level was really linked to the war conditions and to the fact that you had this outbreak emerging in an area that was quite connected with multiple frontiers between different countries, etc. So, in other words, our capacity to early detect and act has also improved over time. So by the end of the day, I'm not that convinced that we are really entering a pandemic era, because our tools to have adapted. And also, in order for a virus to be pandemic, it really needs to have some specific traits that we're starting to better understand. Here, most of the difficulty linked to the fact that you had some asymptomatic infectious people. And that makes a big difference compared to previous pandemic candidates, you know, because it becomes very difficult to contain. So compared to other threats that we have to know to adapt, like, you know, the threat of climate change, etc., I think those are much more certain, so to say, than those of that pandemic are becoming more frequent or more heavy. But that's not excuse for not being prepared, because what this pandemic showed was that, you know, we didn't have an up-to-date pandemic preparedness plan, that many countries were completely unprepared in terms of communication strategies, of everything that goes into a pandemic preparedness plan. And that's a lesson that we should keep for long, and because there's no excuse for that nowadays.
Thank you very much.
And then a quick question for Mathias de Watripon. And a quick answer also, if you can do both. Mathias?
Well, thanks a lot, Marius, for a great talk. I just had a question about the fact that Omicron has really been a game changer and has really changed the view of the indicators of epidemic and all this thing. What would you recommend to the government in terms of communication about, you know, on the one hand, it looks like it has normalized a bit. On the other, when you look at Hong Kong, it's really bad. And with waning immunity and the like, I think that we should neither be alarmist, not banalize, as you said, the thing, but you know, there is, and of course now with Ukraine and so on, this kind of thing, people want to think about other things. But what do you think a proper communication should be?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, first, I mean, we should deconstruct this narrative that Omicron was so milder. Huh? And I think that you rightly pointed at the evidences of Hong Kong, that in a population where the vaccination of the 65 plus is much lower and where there is more vaccine evasion, you know, Omicron had a very hard impact in terms of mortality. So the true game changer, of course, is what a bit milder than the intermediate variants that we've had, certainly Alpha and Delta, but evidences show that it is as dangerous as the first Wuhan one that had a very high burden in our society. So the game changer is not Omicron. The game changer is the fact that we have a population with high level of vaccination, especially with the booster. That's the real game changer, over which the relative mildness of Omicron compared to Delta, you know, led to a situation where indeed transmission didn't lead to as much hospitalization and death than in previous waves. So the first thing is, I think, is to deconstruct that myth, because it is a myth. The second aspect is that you're right. It seems that in terms of communication, certainly it's completely out of the radar now. And that's the combined effect of this apparent higher mildness and the Ukraine war. You know, you combine the two and it's completely out of the radar and out of the media now. But yet it's still, you know, I think the number of deaths per day is still 20 per day, and that's not benign. I mean, if you multiply that by over a year, it's a far more than the burden of influenza. And as you expressed, there is the risk of waning. And now the fact is that more, you know, all of us, or many of us, not all of us, but even if we have, you know, 3 vaccines, many people experience infections, and the infection is not completely gone. It's at a level that is not too damaging, but it maintains also it could have an effect of maintaining kind of immunity as well. So there is the waning of the vaccines, but the fact that there is circulation with a relatively lower health impact could help maintaining, renewing some immunity as well. Now, the balance between the two is completely impossible to predict. So the chances are that with the waning of immunity, combined with there is a bit of a seasonal effect. It's not as strong as other disease, but there is a bit of seasonality, certainly linked to ventilation. The risk is that next autumn we may face again a difficult situation, leading to tense situation in hospitals and leading to a need of resuming some measures and mandatory measures. But it's frankly, it's hard to predict, and we cannot also exclude the emergence of a variant that would be back to the level of virulence that we've had with Delta. So all in all, you know, it's completely out of the radar now. I think that's a problem. It should remain in the radar. And we should be prepared to communicate against around it. Now, one positive thing, and I think it's a positive thing, is that people are now managing it more and more as part of their daily life, and that could have some benefit if we play it well. But that's why I think the communication, thinking of communication strategies should start now with different scenarios, I think.
So we have one last question. I would say 1 minute maximum for the question, 2 minutes maximum for the answer, if you agree, which will take us to 35. So Laura Stilleman, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, but especially for the event and for the role that you have played, Marius, throughout the pandemic. Really, thank you. I will focus on the second question that I had, which is you have mentioned that we should increase science literacy in society, but probably we also need to put more efforts to provide science communication training for scientists, because scientists have the knowledge, and I don't think they are necessarily trained in communicating that knowledge to the public. You have to learn yourself, you mentioned. Is it, I mean, what would be your ideas to improve that? And what do you think about including science communication in the university curriculum of scientific careers? Thank you.
Well, here I'm taking my hat of Vice Rector of Research in my answer. But it connects the two very, very nicely, in fact. I think for the importance, it's clear. The problem is that our scientists, you know, their career is not linked in any way on their capacity to communicate. Most of their career is linked to their capacity to do, you know, very good research, and that's how they evaluate it. You know, you expect scientists mostly to, especially researcher, you know, to produce state-of-the-art research and to make science progress. So the skills that they have in terms of science communication is entirely up to the capacity that they have developed themselves or through teaching. you know, because researcher in an academic career, you do teaching, but you know, everyone who's been to the university knows that the teaching skills of his own professors can vary. So it's a difficult one. Certainly, we're trying to encourage that, to encourage our scientists to engage a lot more actively into communication, and for two reasons. First, because I think university has a role to play in not being disconnected from society. You know, universities are paid by society to progress in terms of knowledge, but we have our role to play in disseminating the knowledge. And scientists are the best ambassador to do that. So we have a responsibility as an institution to try to promote that aspect. And it is true that it is something that is a little bit underdeveloped in universities in general. It's not specific to us. You know, there is, in all university, there is knowledge and technology transfer officers that are linked to how universities can engage the economic fields or institutions. But we don't have the same amount of people who are involved into trying to make the knowledge accessible to a large public. And that's something where we certainly have to invest, but it's not easy to fund that. Because, you know, if for the first one, you can go to the Ministry of Economics and saying, you know, we need help to facilitate this connection between innovation and enterprises, and you will receive budget for that. If it is about communication, it's a lot more difficult to fund. So most of that is funded internally with what we can have. Now, the question of in terms of training, it's a good one, and I think there are initiatives that are being taken by some scientists who are really involved in that, in trying to set up a master in science communications. But I don't know the latest news on that aspect. But definitely, yes, this is something that we know that is important, that we would like to further support.
Thank you, Marius. Hilde, can we agree on the fact that this lecture was amazing?
I was really impressed by the way how you, Marius, as a scientist, you were able to clearly communicate in a very, very open and transparent way. Thank you so much for enjoying and engaging our students in science communication. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marius. Thank you all, actually. And you know that all this has been possible thanks to donations coming from I3h friends. Wish you to support this independence and this high level of science. You will find all the info you need on the I3h website. And you will also find the replay of this conference on the website. So feel free, of course, to share it with a lot of people. Share the link, share the thoughts also. Madam, sir, dear students, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your interest. We wish you a pleasant weekend, and we hope to see you very soon in Brussels.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.